Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Scott Ritter. Scott's name needs no introduction because Scott has been doing a lot of interviews on the subject of disarmament, Russia Ukraine war, NATO, European relations with United States, foreign policy of United States. And I would like Scott to introduce himself in a proper way with all his designations. But the other part of Scott's life that a lot of times goes undetected is that he is a renowned author. He wrote a number of books. I am a proud owner of several of his books, and I'm looking to read some more. And I would like Scott Ritter right now to take the stage and introduce all of his proper titles and designations so we all could learn about what Scott's career was like and what did he do in life that brought him to this level of the expert on U.S. foreign relations, United States weapons and disarmament and treaties and UN subjects. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Scott Ritter. Scott, hello.
Well, hello, Lana. Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast. I'm honored to be here. How to go about introducing myself. The first thing I'd like to point out is my name's Scott. My formal name is William Scott Ritter Jr., but my parents opted not to call me Billy or Junior to differentiate me from my father. So I was Scott. I've been Scott my entire life, and that's the best way to refer to me as. I'm simple Scott. I'm just a regular guy who grew up. I had the opportunity to grow up all around the world. My parents were military professionals, so I went to high school in Hawaii, Turkey, and I graduated from an American high school in Germany. I enlisted in the Army out of high school. I think being a child of a professional military officer during the Cold War, I was imbued with a sense of patriotic duty. So I felt that it was my obligation to serve my country. I enlisted in the Army. It was the post-Vietnam Army, and it did not go well with me. Let's just say that. I was not happy with the Army, the lack of discipline, the level of racism, and the lack of dedication to the service. I was a little bit more fanatical than, say, the United States Army in 1979 was. So I left the Army, went to college, and began the process of becoming a Marine Corps officer, attending officer candidate school every summer while I studied Russian language, Russian history, because I made it my goal. It was the Cold War. The Soviet Union was the enemy. So I made it my goal to know my enemy. I wanted nothing more than to have the opportunity to close with and destroy the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver, go to war with them. That's a little bloodthirsty today, but that's what I was all about in college. I played football, I drank beer, and I prepared my mind to kill Russians. And then I joined the Marine Corps, and I was made an intelligence officer. I was assigned to a field artillery unit where we practiced to perfect the art of delivering high explosive rounds into a Soviet enemy. And we were pretty good at it. We were ready. If the opportunity had come, we would have acquitted ourselves well. Fortunately, and at the time I thought it was unfortunately, but fortunately, wiser minds prevailed. Ronald Reagan, then the President of the United States, sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev in December of 1987 and signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, a treaty to get rid of an entire category of nuclear weapons that had put both the United States and the Soviet Union on the edge of the abyss, so to speak, nuclear conflict. The Marine Corps is tasked with providing a certain number of Russian linguists and experts in Russia to this new inspection agency, the on-site inspection agency. I see you're smiling because you read my book and you know what I'm about to say. I was the exact opposite of an expert. I barely spoke Russian. Like I said, I played football and I drank beer, which means whatever Russian language I was doing wasn't stinking in. And I knew the history pretty well, but I wasn't. I was a very junior officer, very inexperienced, and I was put in the crowd of giants, literal giants, men who were legends in their respective fields. And I write about it in the book. People like Colonel Connell, George Connell, like Ted
Yes.
Inkman, like Roland LaJoy. I could just go on and on and on.
Yes.
These are living legends, people who accomplished so much in the field of intelligence during the Cold War. And here I come in knowing nothing. And the next thing I know, I'm in the Soviet Union. And I've always joked, people are like, well, how did you become an expert in disarmament? And I have to tell you, it's simply by being the first person to do it. You see, when no one else has ever done something and you are literally the first person to do it, you become, by definition, by default, the expert because you're the only one who did it. I was the first person on the ground in the Soviet Union to become an inspector. Everything I did was the first time it had ever been done. It doesn't mean that I was really clever, I was really good. It just meant I had a unique set of experience. And then I was able to capitalize on it. And fortunately, because I was surrounded by some extraordinary people, my peers and my superiors, the things I did tended to succeed. And I got a certain reputation coming out of this wonderful experience of implementing the INF treaty. I got high level attention. The director of the CIA, the commandant of the Marine Corps, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I was recognized again as a very junior officer. I'm getting this recognition, and it was. It was somewhat humbling to be put in that position because, believe me, at the end of the day, when I woke up, I looked in the mirror and I knew the truth. I knew who Scott Ritter was. I knew I wasn't this superstar. I knew I was a guy with a lot of concerns, a lot of doubts, a lot of fears, a lot of, just the kind of things that the average human being has. That's all I am. I'm just simple Scott. I'm not anything extraordinary. But I had this amazing opportunity, this amazing experience that then propelled me on to my next job, which was supposed to be with the Marine Corps. I went to a school, but then the war came. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and suddenly I found myself in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, working on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf as an intelligence officer. But because of my experience in the Soviet Union as a missile inspector, I had the reputation of being the missile guy. I'm not the missile guy. You know this. You read the book. I'm not the missile guy. But they called me the missile guy. And one day, General Cal Waller, who's the deputy commander with 4 stars on his shoulder, comes into the room and he goes, "Where's the missile guy?" I'm like, everybody's looking at me and I'm like, that's me. And I got taken out and I became the Scud expert. I'm not an expert on Scuds. When I was in Vodkinsk, they produced Scuds in Vodkinsk. I didn't know it at the time to show you how stupid I was back then. I just knew about SS-20s, SS-25s, but now Scud was produced. Everybody's like, he was in Vodkinsk. He knows missiles. He knows everything. I know nothing. But now I'm put in charge of trying to come up with ways to kill these Scuds. And long story short, I had what they call a good war. You know what a good war is? That's where you live and you don't screw up. I had a good war, and I came out of the war with a good reputation. I did some interesting things and made my reputation of being a rock solid analyst. And then the war ended, and it was time for me to get out of the Marine Corps. Remember how eager I was to kill Russians out of college? Well, now I had served my country in war, but we were no longer at the Cold War. Russia was no longer the enemy. And the only reason I wanted to join the military was to kill Russians, because it was during the Cold War, they were the enemy. They're not the enemy anymore. I've already served my country in war. And I was like, maybe there's something better I can do in life. Plus, I had fallen in love. There was a young lady I met in Vodkinsk where I served. She was a linguist there on the Russian side. We didn't fall in love there. Trust me, that didn't happen. But during the, when the war ended, it was time for me to get out of the Marine Corps. We reconnected, and so that was going to be my future. I was going to get out of the Marines. I was going to marry this wonderful lady and start a family and move on. And we tried to do that. We got married. But in August 1991, while I'd been given a job offer to go over to the Soviet Union with H.J. Heinz. You might recognize that name. They make ketchup, but they also do food processing. Because, as you saw in my book, I was part of a team that built something out of nothing in the Soviet Union. The H.J. Heinz was going to build a food processing plant in southern Russia, and they wanted me to head up that opportunity. to be the plant manager. And so I was supposed to go over there, and then they had the coup in August of 1991. And H.J. Heinz pulled out of the Soviet Union, and I was unemployed. And then I got a phone call from a colonel, Doug England. I write about him in the book, the guy who fired me. You remember the guy who didn't like me. We turned out to become very good friends. And he had been assigned to the United Nations at the end of the war, tasked with overseeing the creation of an inspection team that would go into Iraq to disarm Iraq. And it turned out the Iraqis were lying. And he said, we need an intelligence capability. And he said, I happen to know an intelligence officer who helped write the book on on-site inspection, who actually fought in the war, and he knows all about Iraqi scuds. Why don't we bring him in, and he can help create this intelligence capability? So in September of 1991, I was brought to the United Nations, where I stayed for 7 years. And over the course of 7 years, I became one of the senior chief inspectors operating in Iraq. I participated in over 45 inspections, 14 of them as chief inspector, many of them controversial, all of them critical. At least 5 of the inspections that I led ended up with Security Council resolutions being passed about the potential for military conflict against Iraq. So the work I did resonated at the highest levels. Let's bring this down to reality. I'm still just Scott Ritter. All of this is happening. And I mean, I have to tell you, on occasion, I would be put on an airplane and flown to a foreign capital. I would get off the airplane and a limousine would come up and a colonel in full uniform would come and open the door and bring me in like I'm some sort of very important person. And then they drive me to a meeting, defense ministry or foreign ministry, and I'm meeting ambassadors and secretaries and generals, and they're all talking to me as if I am the smartest man on the planet. And I'm sitting there going, holy cow, I am literally at this stage 32 years old. And these guys are treating me like I'm some sort of genius, and I'm not. I mean, I was good at what I did, I'm not going to lie, but it was all very humbling. It was one of the most unique experiences of my life. But in the end of the day, in 1998, it became clear that the U.S. government was promoting a policy that I couldn't support. My job was to disarm Iraq. The U.S. government was promoting regime change policy, using my team for purposes that they weren't designed to be used by the Security Council. So I resigned. And from 1998 until today, I've been speaking out critically of American foreign policy, not because I hate my country, just the opposite. I love my country more than anything. I would die for my country. I've already believed that. But I think it's the duty and responsibility of every American citizen to hold their elected representatives accountable for what is done in their name. And if we are enacting policies abroad that are inconsistent with the values that we claim to espouse as a nation, then we must speak out. And so I've been speaking out ever since. And that's what brings me to your podcast today.
Yes, thank you. And I have been speaking out too. I mean, in a smaller capacity, of course, not on the world stage or in Iraq, but yes, I've been speaking about the Ukraine situation since who knows when. From whenever it was even possible to post something on the internet. I commend you, Scott, for your courage. You seem to have a very humble approach to your magnanimous persona and how famous you are now, and obviously you take it very, very humbly, which is very commendable. But I would like to say to you is that a lot of people look up to you because we as Americans, media has been lying to us. Media has been complicit in perpetuating a lot of the politicians' narratives. And people are looking for someone with courage and with honest approach who could, like yourself, explain to us what is our foreign policy like? Why are we running around the world changing regimes? How close are we to the nuclear war if this doesn't end? Is this really a danger, or are we just imagining things? I mean, people are looking for answers, and unfortunately, neither our politicians or our media provide those answers. So I applaud you for doing that and taking the time of your day, and you're busy writing, because you could be writing books right now, but you're actually meeting with people like myself who try to bring the message to the wider audience, and you meet with others at the various events. I've seen and followed how you meet with people and do the question answer sessions. It's very important what you do, and please do not underestimate yourself. But the question about foreign policy, one of the questions I have is, remember, Scott, is a very confusing subject, and that United States always refers to as a rules-based international order. What is it? Why does Russia seems to have a complaint against this rule-based international order? Because it's not a law, because it's something that America just institutes and changes that will. What is rules international order, and why does Russia say that they no longer wish to have the world be based on rules-based order? What is it, Scott? Can you enlighten us on that?
Sure. Look, during the Second World War, the five victorious powers, the United States, France was sort of brought in at the end, but the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and again, China was sort of brought in at the end as well, agreed that this kind of conflict could never happen again. I mean, let's just look at it from the Soviet perspective. 27 million dead, an entire half of their country devastated. From the European perspective, again, an entire continent just ravaged by war. The American perspective, while our homeland didn't suffer as much, we still lost a lot of people, and it was a full effort on the United States on two fronts, a Pacific War and a European war, and it exhausted the nation. Even though we didn't suffer the human cost that the Soviets suffered, the nation was exhausted by it, and there was a recognition that this could not happen again. But now, how do we go about making sure it doesn't happen again? And the concept of a United Nations was created. The idea that the victorious powers would come together and bring the international community together as a United Nation, sort of a follow-on from the League of Nations that was created after the last World War, World War I. But the League of Nations failed. It had no teeth. It had no ability to enforce. And so the victorious powers decided they would create something called the Security Council. They would be permanent members with vetoes, but they would work together with the world to impose a rule of law. And that's what we're talking about, the rule of law per the Charter of the United Nations. But now the United States is looking at this, and the United States is in a little bit of a quandary at the end of the Second World War. You see, prior to the war, we had been in a Great Depression. Our economy was in the tanks. It was the war that enabled us to come out of this depression, the war that enabled us to go into a war production footing, get our heavy industry reinvigorated, to bring the American economy alive. And we were positioned after the war to be the dominant global economy, to control the world. Now, there's nothing in the United Nations Charter that talks about this. The United Nations Charter doesn't talk about the relationship between the dollar and the pound, the dollar and any other currency. But we do. We imposed it on the world. Well, actually, that's not fair. We had a system that, because of the war, was imposed on the world. And now for us to direct the world in the way we wanted, we needed to sustain this system. And it is this system that it operates outside of the framework of the United Nations Charter, the rule of law, that became known as the rules-based international order. And one of the key elements of it was the way the United States would provide aid to other nations to help with reconstruction. It was done in a way that would promote the dominance of the dollar. The dollar would become the currency of exchange. We had the Marshall Plan for Europe, and then we extended the Marshall Plan to Eastern Bloc countries that were then occupied by the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the war. And several of these countries wanted to engage, but the Soviets said, no, we're not thrilled about the idea of the dollar coming in and becoming the dominant currency. And so the Soviets balked at being involved in this. And there was a guy named George Kennan, a famous American diplomat. And a lot of people, he wrote something called the Long Telegram. And people recognize that in history as the document that started the conversation that led to a policy of containing the Soviet Union, because he painted a very stark and dark portrait of the Soviets as being in opposition to the West, America. But if you go back to what prompted his long telegram, it wasn't Stalin trying to flex his muscles to take over Eastern Europe or the Soviets threatening to go to war. It was the Soviets simply saying, we don't want the dollar coming into our country. That's it. We reject this. If there's a way to bring aid, we'll do it, but we're not going to allow you to come in and dictate how our economy works. And so Kennan overreacted. He basically used that rejection to say the Soviets will never cooperate with the West, will never be on our side, and that we are looking for perpetual conflict. Now, he didn't mean war. He meant ideological conflict, economic conflict. But the national security people in Washington, D.C. said, no, he means war. We have to prepare for that. So this became what's called NSC 68, which are National Security Document, NSD 68, which was a document under the Truman administration that defined a new policy of containment, containing the Soviet Union. But now, how do we contain the Soviet Union? We have to do it in mechanisms outside of the framework of the United Nations, because the Soviet Union is a permanent member of the United Nations. So you can't use the United Nations to contain the Soviet Union. You need to construct a new framework through the World Bank, through International Monetary Fund, through NATO. We had other alliances, CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, which had Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Iraq together. CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. We created treaty organizations that surrounded the Soviet Union, and then we bolstered them with aid, economic dominance, et cetera, to impose a order that isn't law-based. It doesn't come from the charter. It's rules-based, dictated by the United States. There's no international agreement that says this is to be. It was the United States saying, this is how it's going to be. We are the supreme power. We will dictate the solution to our unilateral advantage. That is the rules-based international order. But today, the rules-based international order worked. Let's use an analogy, and I'm going to irritate every country in the world, and I apologize. But at the end of the Second World War, basically the United States was the adult, and the rest of the world were children. They were children. They had destroyed economies. They couldn't function. They needed the adult to guide them. And this is the God's honest truth. I'm not being insulted. Even Great Britain and France needed America to guide them, to help them. But at some point in time, children grow up. And when the children grow up, as all children, they no longer, now that they are adults, they do not want to be governed by the rules set forth by their parents. They want to function as equals. And this is where we are today. The world has grown up, and the world sort of gets angry when the United States tries to dictate solutions. Now, we have some people, let's call them the spoiled, rotten children, who loved being under their parents' wing, and they live in the basement. You know, those kind, the 30-year-olds who live in the basement still, and that's what Europe is. Europe is a continent of basement dwellers, people who never grew up, who've always lived under the umbrella of the United States. Japan is a basement dweller. South Korea is a basement dweller. Australia is a basement dweller. These are children that just didn't grow up. They're so comfortable to be under mommy's wing, daddy's wing, and they just want to stay that way forever. But then there are the others, the sturdy kids who said, thank you for your help, but we're now adults. India, China, Russia, Africa, the African continent is full of adults. Asia is full of adults. People who said, we don't want to be treated like children anymore. We want a seat at the table. And when we sit at the table, we don't want Papa America coming at the head of the table telling us when we can eat, what we can eat, how we can eat. We want to make a determination. We want to look at the menu and select for ourselves what we want from the menu, what's best for us. America's welcome to sit at the table. In fact, America must sit at the table because America is a player, but they sit at the table. not at the head of the table. And that's where Russia is today. They're saying, look, we will work with America. We're not rejecting America, but America isn't our boss. America doesn't get to dictate to us. America must sit with us and work with us as equals in a multipolar world. In order to do that, and here's the key part, Russia and China met in February of last year in Beijing, February 4th, and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping released a 5,000 plus word joint statement that rejected the rules-based international order, said it's dead, and they said instead we're going to replace it with a law-based international order, and the law being the United Nations Charter. Russia and China are getting back to first principles, back to the basics, back to what the world was supposed to look like at the end of the Second World War, where the charter defined notions of equality for all, as opposed to what America did, which is to try and impose a rules-based order where America is the singular power around which everything rotates. I hope I provided an explanation.
Excellent explanation. Thank you, Scott. When I read your book, and let's mention the book, it's Disarmament at the Time of Perestroyka. Not many people know what perestroika is. Oh, thanks for showing it. I read it on Kindle version. I have the other book, hard copy, but that one on Kindle, so I can't show it. But it was an excellent book. I recommend everyone to read it. It's just perfect. I mean, historical references, personal experiences, Scott details in that book. It's amazing, wonderful book, and it's a great read. I recommend it highly. In your book, Scott, you talked about disarmament and how important it is. I remember there was something about cargo scan that you guys tried to do to scan these missiles to find out, like, what is it inside? I mean, there's so much technical information. I don't pretend to understand all of the technical parts, but it seems
neither do I.
It seems so laborious and intense that I was like, in all the numbers, you have to just like, wow, Scott knows all these numbers. And that book's just amazing. But what I did, I looked up the nuclear, like who has the most nuclear weapons, because I'm sure we're all concerned about nuclear, thermonuclear war, however people want to call this. I am afraid that, like you said, adults in the room, who are the adults in the room anymore? I see the war between Russia, Ukraine, NATO. Everybody's trying to get in. Poland tries to get in. Zelensky screams, let's do a preemptive strike on Russia. Medvedev, a Russian former president, comes out yesterday and says, oh, those people in Davos are, talking about that peace only can be achieved if Russia loses on the battlefield. He says, I have news for them. No nation with nuclear weapons have ever lost a major conflict like that. So when I hear all this talk about nuclear, thermonuclear, and then I read your book and how you advocate for disarmament, I looked up to see who has the nuclear, heads or weapons and who had them before. I came across the article and it showed that the peak of everybody having the most, I almost think it was 70,000 warheads. I mean, there was something upwards of dozens and dozens of these warheads. I think it was around 70s, 80s or something. And then it's a sharp drop. And now United States and at this time Russia, they tread sort of evenly on the amount. Russia has a little bit more, but it's not like at the time when I looked back at the chart, the Soviet Union had more than everyone as far as nuclear weapons. And now United States and Russia are pretty much plus minus, I'm thinking few hundred warheads. But Scott, looking at the chart, I looked at the time frame and I said, maybe, again, I'm a business person. I don't claim to be a politician or know anything about, the inner workings of how people do this. I am looking at it as a rational person. Doesn't it seem like when Soviet Union had the most warheads, then there was less wars based on that chart? Because I'm looking at Obama's time when weapons dropped already and they're quite low. Then I see that this is the period when Libya war started and Iraq war started and Syria war started and all these wars. And I'm thinking, I'm going to ask Scott. Scott, what do you think? I mean, did disarmament help to curb the situation in the world to be more peaceful? Or, I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it really a deterrent to have nuclear weapons? Of course, they're horrible and we don't ever want anybody to use them. And Russia doesn't want to use them. And I hope United States doesn't want to use them. But we always thought that this is sort of a deterrent. But the more we go this year and the last year with Russia Ukraine, the more I see that there is a very real possibility of nuclear exchange. And that scares us all. But what do you think? Because the peak of everybody having nuclear weapons almost kind of, to me, as a rational human being, seems like it had less wars. And when they drop, now that we have all these wars, I mean, does it have anything to do with it? Or this is just our policy? Or, and Russia, pardon, just finish. And if Russia says that we don't trust United States, if we have a disarmament and you, let's say, work on the disarmament with Russia, which I know that those negotiations stalled again, START treaty, or what is it, New START treaty, something along these lines. And I think you mentioned it, that Russians even said that American side now tries to redefine the words inside that treaty. In other words, if Russia cannot trust United States in disarmament, and according to you, disarmament is the way to go, how does this all fit? And does disarmament help to create more peace in the world? Or does these terrible weapons, do they provide a deterrent? I hope it's not too much info in one question. What do you think, Scott?
No, good question. Let me just start off by making the following points. The United States became a nuclear power in 1945. I think Russia followed a few years later. In 1950, we had the Korean War. Nuclear weapons didn't stop the Korean War. In 1956, we had the Suez Crisis. Nuclear weapons didn't stop the Suez Crisis. In the 60s, we had the Vietnam War. Nuclear weapons didn't stop that. Russia had a war in Afghanistan in the 70s and the 80s. Nuclear weapons didn't stop that. And there were countless wars beyond that. There was the Iran-Iraq War. Israel fought several wars with its Arab neighbors. China fought a border war with Vietnam. And we just go on and on and on. So unfortunately, nuclear weapons don't prevent war. What kept us from destroying each other with nuclear weapons at that time wasn't so much that we had so many of them. It's that we recognized that if there was a nuclear war, we would both die. It's called mutually assured destruction. When we first started building nuclear weapons, we were looking for advantages to basically say we are the spirit. We were planning for active war. Had we gone to war against the Soviet Union in the 60s, the first thing we'd have done is nuke Russian cities, automatic, just nuke them, and they would try to nuke some of us. And we had these game theorists who came up with how we would win a nuclear war. And we would win the nuclear war by destroying the Soviet Union's ability to continue to exist as a modern nation state while preserving enough population and industrial capacity so that the United States could reconstitute itself, knowing that we would lose 100 million people. Now, when John F. Kennedy, back when he became president, when he was taken down to the Pentagon to be briefed on what we back then we called the SIOP, Singular Inter-Operational Plan, or I don't know what it was, but the PSYOP is what it was called, which is our nuclear war plan. And he came down, and remember, he's the commander in chief. He gets to make the call. He comes down to the Pentagon, and they present him a plan. And he says, wait a minute. So if we go to war, we're going to kill everybody. And he said, yes, sir. He said, but I want options. They said, there are no other options. He said, I want options. And so they built options. They came back and gave him a plan that said, and he said, but wait a minute. If I do this plan, it automatically goes to this plan. So there is no option. You've just made it cuter. And he walked out and he turned to an aide and he said, and we call ourselves the human race, meaning what has gone wrong with us? And every president that's been briefed on the American nuclear war plan since then has come away with the same reaction. This is literally insanity. And fortunately, in the 1960s, we're in the business now of building newer weapons, and the Russians are catching up. They're building newer weapons. So we're building, missiles that can reach out and destroy a Russian silo. So the Russians harden their silo and build missiles with multiple warheads to come and attack us. So then we build missiles with multiple warheads and we put them on submarines. And then the Russians do this, and then we do this. And next thing you know, we're both going, holy cow, we're about to kill each other. And so we started building missile defense systems. And we're testing them, and we realize they don't work, and they're very expensive. So rather than continue this arms race, we sat down with the Soviets and said, why don't we get rid of ballistic missile defense? Why don't we make it so that we understand that if there's a war, there is no defense? If there's a nuclear war, we were all going to die. And we both embraced this concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD. And lo and behold, we stopped trying to kill each other. And next thing you know, from the ABM Treaty, which I believe was signed in 1972, comes what we call the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty. Not reducing weapons, but slowing how we expand them to eliminate certain types of missiles that were called destabilizing. And then we had SALT 1, then we had SALT 2. But then disarmament ran into a hiccup. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter prevented the final ratification of SALT 2, and arms control sort of went to a hiatus. And then after Jimmy Carter came a guy named Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was like, I don't believe in any of this arms control stuff, ironically. He's the guy that said, we're going to do something called Strategic Defense Initiative, which was literally a violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but he didn't care. And he also started to build new categories of nuclear weapons that would give us first strike capability. That is, that we can reach out and hit the Soviets, eliminate their capability so they can't retaliate. And we were planning on, once again, winning a nuclear war. Frightening stuff. Then in the late 1970s, the Soviets deployed a missile, and I write about it in my book, the SS-20, the Pioneer. And it's a road mobile missile, solid rocket fuel, which means it doesn't take long to get ready to fire. The vehicle stops, raises, fires, and off goes a missile with 3 nuclear warheads that can take out 3 European cities. And the Soviets built hundreds of these missiles. And the Europeans are going, whoa, 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 time out. This is awful. What are we going to do about it? And America said, well, we'll deploy our own intermediate nuclear forces onto European soil. And the Europeans are going, wait a minute. So we got a problem between America and the Soviet Union, and we're going to pay the price. If there's a war, we're going to die. And they didn't like it. There were massive demonstrations in Europe against this, but NATO made the decision that the only way to confront the SS-20 was to deploy these systems. One of the systems deployed was called the Pershing 2. We had a Pershing 1 missile. The Pershing 2, again, is a solid rocket missile with a warhead. But the thing about it is, if it got fired from a base in West Germany, it could hit Moscow in 7 minutes. And that means that there's no time to think. So if the missile gets fired and is heading towards Moscow, the Russians don't have a time to say, oh, was this a false alarm? Was this a mistake? They have to assume that this was indeed the attack, and they have to fire everything. And the Russians had something called the dead hand. The dead hand system that, let's say the Pershing 2 got through and killed everybody in the Kremlin. Doesn't matter. The dead hand takes over. And the dead hand has sensors, acoustic sensors, radiation sensors. And if communications is no longer coming out of Moscow, the dead hand automatically goes, launch everything. And they fire these missiles that have communications capsules, and it flies over the Soviet Union, broadcasting the launch codes, and all the missiles get fired to the United States, and the world ends. So now you say, oh gosh, well, okay, but still, it's not that bad, right? No. In 1983, NATO held an exercise called Able Archer 83, 83 being the year. Able Archer was the final exercise in a sequence of exercises called Reforger, Return of Forces to Germany. We had 300,000 troops stationed in Germany at the time, but to fight the Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces, we needed 500,000. But we didn't want to station 500,000 there. So we would fly in 200,000, 250,000 troops. And we trained to do this every year. And so in 1983, we flew in tens of thousands of American forces who married up with their tanks and everything, and they were positioned. And the Soviets are looking at this going, They just built up their forces. They're pointed at us. And now Able Archer 83 comes in, which is a nuclear command post exercise that for the first time is going to practice what is needed to launch nuclear weapons against the Soviets. And the Soviets are going, they are getting ready to do a preemptive first strike. They're going to hit us with nuclear weapons. So the Soviets put all those SS-20s on high alert. Now they're out there ready to launch. They put their airplanes on the runway with nuclear bombs attached, pilot in the cockpit, engine running, so that the second there was a hint of an accident, they take off and they start. We were that close to nuclear war, that close. Later on, when Ronald Reagan was briefed on it, someone said, yeah, well, we dodged a bullet there. The Soviets actually thought we were going to attack. He said, they didn't really think that, did they? And they said, yes, sir, they did. And he said, that's insane. And that moment combined with, there was an assassination attempt against Reagan. And while he was in the hospital bed of recovery, he watched a program put on by ABC News called The Day After about nuclear war. And he said, is this real? And one of his advisors said, no, sir, that's nothing. Reality would be far worse. Oh, and he said, that's insane. Yeah. So suddenly this guy, Ronald Reagan, who was a Cold Warrior, who, wanted to learn to fight a winnable nuclear war, woke up to the insanity of it all. Yeah. And they began the process of working with the Soviets through disarmament to get rid of these weapons that had put us on the brink of nuclear conflict. So one of your questions is the world safer because of disarmament? Let me put it this way, as stark as I can. Had there not been an INF treaty, we would all be dead because there would have been a nuclear war. An accident would have occurred. These weapons would have been used, and it'd be all over. You and I wouldn't be having this conversation. So disarmament made us safer. I know there's a lot of people in the former Soviet Union and Russia who take an opposite point of view. They feel that nuclear weapons is the only thing that gives them relevance. No, there's so much more that gives Russia relevance than nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, because of the attitude the United States has taken in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet environment, we no longer treat the Russians with respect. We signed an INF treaty that was mutual. Both parties respected, it was reciprocal, etc. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, there were many people who believed we don't need to treat the Russians like we treated the Soviets, that we should, instead of negotiating treaties that reduce both, we should negotiate treaties that increase our strength, our power, our prestige. Mm-hmm. And the Russians weren't in any position to argue with them. Boris Yeltsin had his arm twisted to sign up to treaties that were inadequate, to use a Russian turn of the phrase. And now we're in a situation where we desperately need arms control. Donald Trump, George W. Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty. So now the United States is deploying anti-ballistic missile systems on the periphery of Russia, and Russia has every right to be concerned about this. And now we're getting ready. We got out of the INF treaty, and we're getting ready to deploy a new category of missile, which, like Pershing II, if fired, can strike Moscow in 5 minutes. Well, you know what the Russians have retained? The dead hand. Nobody's talking about it. It's there. So we're literally reliving history as we speak. And here's the frustrating part. Earlier we talked about National Security Document 68, the containment strategy. The guy who wrote that was named Paul Nietzsche. And he was a Cold Warrior. He did not like the Soviet Union, didn't trust him at all, etc. But, that was written in the early 1950s. In the early 1980s, 30 years later, guess who is our INF treaty negotiator? Ooh. Paul Nietzsche. Paul Nietzsche. And what I'm trying to say is, here's a man with 30 years experience under his belt. He has seen it all. He has lived through everything. He's lived through every aspect of the Cold War, the ABM treaty, the SALT treaties, etc. So when he's sitting down with his Soviet counterparts now, they're very experienced people who know how to negotiate. They understand what's at stake. They understand the consequences. And because of that, we got the INF treaty. Only because of this experience, because of these veterans, these experienced arms controllers. Then when we walked away from serious arms control, Paul Nietzsche retires. All the people who negotiated these treaties are retired. And because we're not using the disarmament muscles, they atrophy. And today we have no disarmament staff. worthy of the name. Yes, we have people in the position, but they don't know arms control. They don't know treaties. They don't know how to negotiate a treaty. They don't know how to treat the Russians with respect. Unfortunately, the State Department, which used to take the lead in this, has been bullied out of the way by the Defense Department. And the Defense Department's in the business of buying weapons, building new units, using the weapons. You can't make them in charge of
disarmament. Yeah.
And yet, and in Russia, it's the same thing. And remember, disarmament is a two-way street. You can have the best disarmament staff in the world, but if the other side isn't coming to the table, you're not using them. And because most disarmament professionals are very skilled diplomats, they then get sent off to do other work. And on the Russian side, the same thing. Their strong disarmament muscle has atrophied. One of their most experienced current arms control specialists is Anatoly Antonov, the man who negotiated the New START Treaty. Today, he's the Russian ambassador to the United States. But he says, he's given interviews where he says, I'm literally a bird in a gilded cage. Here I am, an expert on disarmament, expert on America, in America at a time when we desperately need disarmament, and nobody will talk to me. Nobody will talk to me. I'm by myself here. It's an absolute waste of resources. And he said the same thing, that in Russia, the defense ministry has taken over the disarmament portfolio. And again, it's the same mistake. So now we have a situation where the American Defense Department and the Russian Defense Ministry are responsible for disarmament, and they don't want to disarm. They're taking the exact opposite approach. We need a strong, robust nuclear capability. And now the United States is talking about redeploying INF system. This is where history becomes important, because we've done this before, and it almost led to the end of the world. We're making the same mistakes as we did in the past, only this time we don't have Paul Nietzsche. We don't have experienced people. We have amateurs. We have generals who don't want to disarm in charge of putting these weapons in place. And we're back to that situation that we were in 1983 after Able Archer, where we were this close to a nuclear war. But this time we don't have the means to rapidly reduce the tension through the enactment and negotiation of a meaningful treaty. We live in very, very dangerous times.
Scott, my next question ties in with the nuclear and the disarmament. As you say, and advocate strongly for disarmament, how do you view, let's say Scott Ritter gets his wish and saves the world, and everybody agrees to have nuclear weapons go away. Do you think they're going to come up with some other weapons as deadly, or is there any other, I don't know, types of weapons? Because it seems like countries always want to have a hegemony of sorts and superiority as to what type of weapons and what type of, a little power that they have. And then again, if United States and Russia would have achieved in the future some type of a disarmament agreement that would actually work, and you can expect it too, to make sure it works, and not just on paper, right? But what about China? What about Pakistan? They have nuclear weapons too. In other words, how do you see the nuclear weapons problem as in a world context, not just Russia, United States? And then if there was a disarmament and let's say nuclear weapons became a thing of the past, what would become a new thing? Because we know countries likely are going to invent something or already have some other weapons. Or maybe you think this is okay. As soon as they're not nuclear, let them have it. What do you think?
Well, first of all, nuclear weapons are right now the only weapon that can end life on the world. You can come up with any biological weapon you want, any chemical weapon, and the effects are limited. It's horrible. I'm not downplaying it, but nuclear weapons are that which can destroy the planet.
Okay.
We have to be careful when we talk about disarmament that perfect is the enemy of good enough, meaning that if you're looking for the perfect disarmament vehicle that encompasses all of the complexity that exists, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, India, China, France, England, not just the United States and Russia, you're getting nothing accomplished. I think that we have to go back to first principles. Disarmament right now is the most important facet of disarmament is between the United States and Russia to eliminate the immediate threat of global nuclear war. The INF Treaty, resuming the INF Treaty is perhaps the most important thing we can do, followed by making sure we have a replacement vehicle for the New START Treaty, which expires in 2026. Now, what happens when you do this? You set a precedent of successful disarmament that you can now take, for instance, to China and India and say, why don't you guys work on coming up with some sort of nuclear control regime between the two of you? India and Pakistan. Why don't we get India and Pakistan together? And because India is involved in both China and Pakistan now, there needs to be a balance between the three powers. They sit down and negotiate a framework of disarmament between the three of them that reduces the possibility of nuclear conflict. Israel is difficult, but Israel can't be ignored because they can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons when nobody else is allowed to have them. France and the UK, I think it's imperative that people need to understand that, you know, when the United States disarms with Russia, there's three categories of nuclear weapons in Europe that aren't covered. First is the B-61 bombs that the United States has in Europe that we have allocated to the NATO nuclear deterrence, meaning they're American bombs but can be used by NATO aircraft during war. These are not allowed to be counted as part of the overall nuclear numbers. The same thing with the French and the British nuclear deterrence. They're not counted, and yet in a war between the United States and Russia, NATO and Russia, those weapons would be used. This has to end. There has to be a mechanism that incorporates all of these systems so that we reduce everything evenly. Only disarmament can do that. But again, the key thing here, remember, we didn't have much, you know, the INF Treaty was signed in 1987, implemented in 1988, and the Soviet Union went away in 1991. The START Treaty was signed in July of 1991, the Soviet Union went away in December of 1991. And then from there, disarmament sort of got confused on. We only have a limited window where disarmament was actually working. We never really got to see it bear the full fruit that it was intended to do. We need to get back to first principles, put in place a viable arms control regime that can serve as a template of success to be replicated elsewhere in the world. You can't get everything at once. There has to be baby steps. But, you know, how does a baby go on the path of becoming a marathon runner who finishes the Boston Marathon? One step at a time. Got to take that first step, then the second step. You got to learn to walk, then you learn to run, and then you learn to run faster. Then you learn to run long distances, and then you finish the race. But if you take the baby and say, you need to run the marathon right now, the baby ain't running the marathon. Yeah. We're back at baby steps right now. We have to come back to basic principles, getting some sort of verifiable arms control regime in place that teaches the United States and Russia to trust one another again. Remember Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. Well, the best way to learn to trust somebody is with a very good verification system. And that only comes through an arms control treaty. And that's what we need to do. We need to negotiate a very good arms control treaty that isn't perfect, doesn't solve every problem, but sets an example that can be followed by others.
So you're saying that it will not completely eliminate nuclear weapons. There will be still the types of nuclear capacities or capabilities, but the major ones would be eliminated. Like, in other words, in your perfect picture, if there was this New START Treaty continuation, how would you see it? Would there still be a nuclear capable, I don't know, weapons, missiles left, or just some major ones eliminated, or everything eliminated over time? Or how do you see that? What would you suggest in your view?
What would I suggest is a completely different thing than reality. But first of all, we need to understand that crossing that Boston Marathon finish line is nuclear zero. That means no nuclear weapons in the world. That is the goal we should all be working toward. But you can't have a situation where one nation possesses nuclear weapons and nobody else does. Nuclear zero means the entire world has agreed that there will be no nuclear weapons. In fact, that is sort of the the premise of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a world free of nuclear weapons, but the nuclear power states are not living up to their obligation to disarm. Again, baby steps. Again, I would seek to breathe life back into the INF Treaty to get rid of these destabilizing intermediate range missiles back on European soil. No Dark Eagle, whatever the Russians are doing, eliminate all that. But then on New START, what would I do with a New START treaty is I would make everything accountable. One of the big problems with New START treaty is the way it was negotiated is that they created categories of non-deployed systems. So basically, each side can play games by saying, this is what we deploy, but over here is non-deployed, therefore not accounted. And so you have this massive force in reserve. No reserve force. It's everything counts, and we have to get it down close enough. But remember, when the United States first started planning global thermonuclear war, it was determined we needed 400 weapons to destroy everything. 400. Okay, today we have what, 1,700? So right off the bat, we know that we have too many weapons. We can bring these down. We don't need this many weapons. Two, let's, the delivery systems. We have silo-based missiles. We have missiles deployed on submarines, and then we have weapons that can be deployed by bombers. Submarines are difficult. They're very survivable. They're out in the ocean, and everybody's always going to be scared of that. I think we need to get rid of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and we need to get rid of silo-based missiles because they're expensive and they literally don't accomplish anything. Silo-based missiles simply become targets. I think technology today will enable us to both Russia and the United States to have sufficient nuclear strike capability in air-delivered systems. That means bombers with standoff nuclear weapons. And the beauty of this is that they're easy to track, easy to account. They can be moved for security. So if I'm the Americans, it's not like my missiles are in silos trapped in one place. I can move them if I need them, but they can be tracked, they can be monitored, they can be inspected. And so I would seek to simplify the world's nuclear arsenal into a single category of weapons that become very easy to classify, very easy to identify, very easy to contain and inspect. But that's asking a lot. I think the first thing we need to do is just agree that we have to keep the numbers low. And then we talk, and this is where, issues of economy come in, because nuclear weapons are very expensive. And, right now the United States is in the process of modernizing all three legs of its triad. It's submarines, it's ground-based missiles, and it's bombers. And estimates are that this is going to cost us hundreds of billions of dollars in the course of the next 10 years, maybe over $1 trillion by the time defense industry comes in and, has cost overruns, contract extensions, et cetera. That's a lot of money. And Russia is facing the same thing. But fortunately for Russia, they've already modernized. They have the Sarmat missile, they have the Avant-Garde, they have this new Poseidon missile, they have other systems that they're developing. So Russia's actually ahead of the United States right now in the nuclear arms race, which if you're a Russian, I guess you feel pretty good about that. But that means that the Americans are going to now spend to bring it up. At some point in time, we need to bring this all under control. And that's what arms control does. We need to stop the arms race. We need to stop wasting time trying to come up with weapons that can destroy the other side and bring it down to the most basic component. We have nuclear weapons that serve as a deterrence against any other nation using nuclear weapons against us. And at some point in time, we all agree that we don't need nuclear weapons, and we take it down to zero, and there's nothing left, and we move forward. That doesn't mean that the world will be defenseless, because we live in a day and age, for instance, with hypersonic missiles, that you don't need a nuclear weapon to take out a leadership. We can destroy command and control capabilities around the world using hypersonic missiles. We can destroy underground facilities using ballistic missile delivered kinetic weapons. So we don't have to have nuclear weapons. And if the world wants to survive, we have to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Scott, in your book, disarmament in the time of Perestroika. And again, for those who don't know, Perestroika is the Russian word for rebuilding, or basically a shift. That was the time during Gorbachev's time in Soviet Union, when the glasnost, openness, and supposedly more freedom was starting to permeate into the very rigid structure of the Soviet Union at the time. You said, Scott, that the treaty at the time in your book, that you guys, American inspectors, went to Votkinsk, the town in Russia, Russian Republic, I would say, a part of Soviet Union back then. But did Russian inspectors come over here? Did you, or was it only one side that could have come? Americans could come over there. Were the Russians coming over here in the United States to inspect our missiles?
Yes, I mean, when the treaty was first devised, there were four kinds of inspections because we needed to get rid of the SS-20 missiles, SS-4, SS-5, and some others, and they need to get rid of our cruise missiles and our Pershing IIs. So we had what we call baseline inspections, and so American inspectors would go over to all of the Soviet bases that were used to produce, to store, to train, to operate their missiles, and they would do an inspection that was based upon what the Soviets declared. The Soviets said, "This is what we have." We went over and we inspected and we ensured that what they said they had, we could find, and we could account for everything. And they did that to us. They came over and did the same thing to all of our bases. Then we did what's called elimination inspections, where we destroy this equipment. And there are protocols for this. And so we destroyed theirs, they destroyed theirs under our supervision, and we destroyed ours under their supervision. Then we had what's called closeout inspections. Once a base had been eliminated, all the treaty limited items eliminated, we would come in and inspect it and then say, yes, everything that was supposed to be destroyed has been destroyed. This base is closed out. There's no reason for us to come back here. And then we had what's called short notice inspections. That was just a test. Remember, trust but verify? So even though you said that this base was closed out, we come back and inspect it to make sure it's closed out. And you don't know we're coming. We do a short notice surprise inspection just to make sure that you're telling the truth. And they did that to us too. That wasn't the inspection I did. The treaty was signed in December of 1987. In November, as they're preparing the final document, the Soviets came up and confessed. They said that SS-20 missile that we're getting rid of, the first stage, is exactly the same as the SS-25 intercontinental ballistic missile that we still produce at Votkinsk. Now, the interesting thing about Votkinsk is early on in the negotiations of the INF Treaty, the Russians wanted to keep a force of around 160 SS-20s, but in Asia. They said, we need this against the Chinese. And we said, well, the problem is, one, you can move those missiles to Europe anytime you want. Two, if you have them there, how do we know it's only 168? We have to monitor the production. And so we need to build this, what we call a portal, a system of detection around this factory and inspect everything that comes out of the factory. And at that time, we came up with the concept of cargo scan, this giant X-ray machine. And we told the Soviets, we're going to build a giant X-ray machine that X-rays everything. And the Soviets went, no, you're not. We're never going to allow this to happen. Therefore, we're getting rid of all of our SS-20s. We're not going to keep any. We're just going to get, because we don't want you in Votkinsk. We don't want this at all. But now they've admitted there's a missile where the first stage is just like the SS-20, and they have no choice now, because either it's admit that they made a mistake and the treaty goes away, and then we have Reagan and Gorbachev are going to be pretty angry, or they say, we're going to sign the treaty, but what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to agree to a portal. So they came up with a fifth category, the perimeter portal monitoring. That's what I did. But the other inspections all had these detailed protocols already worked out. Everything was agreed to, how you fly, how you land, how you eat, how you breathe, how you do anything. You couldn't do anything unless it was controlled by the protocol. But with Votkinsk, there was no protocol. They said, well, we'll figure it out afterwards. And so they signed the treaty, and now we begin the process. We have 6 months until the treaty is implemented. How do we do this? And so we're working with the Soviets, and we can't agree on anything. And it's like, no, well, we'll let the inspectors figure it out. So now they bring in inspectors. Now, remember what I told you early on about the first inspector on the ground?
Yes.
So understand what I'm saying here.
Yes.
Important treaty in the world with the most complicated kind of inspection ever devised. They're saying, let the inspectors work it out. And the first inspector on the ground is the biggest idiot on the face of the planet, the man who knows nothing. He's now going to figure this out. But
he has a lot of enthusiasm and a big heart. He is ready to go. That accounts for a lot of success in my book.
It worked. But now we did this there. But the key aspect of the treaty is reciprocity. We did not have an equivalent situation in the United States. We didn't have a factory that was producing missiles that looked like something that looked like that. What we had was a facility in Magna, Utah, where we had produced the Pershing missile. They produced the stage of the Pershing missile. So the Soviets built a facility there. We had to create a portal because, like I said, it wasn't analogous. It wasn't the same, but we had to make it the same. So we created a portal so that everything that came out of the plant that used to produce Pershing 2 went through so the Soviets could inspect it. But it wasn't the same. They didn't have the SS-25 missile with a cargo scan and all that. But there were Soviet inspectors on the ground. And what was interesting about this is, remember I talked about reciprocity. Reciprocity is okay when you have short notice inspections because everything's governed by the protocols. But with us now, we had 30 Americans living full-time in Votkinsk, which was a closed city. It was a secret military city. No foreigner had ever been there before. And you have 30 Soviets living in Magna, Utah, outside of a missile production facility where no foreigner had ever been before. So I would imagine that the KGB was like, we don't like this. And I know for a fact the FBI was saying, we don't like this either. And so both sides are distrustful. The thing about inspections is, yes, as I talked about in the book, we had to work through how to do the inspections properly. But we also had to work through how to live amongst the Soviets. And that was a problem. You saw in the book how we had to learn how to accept one another, test things out, become comfortable with one another. And while we're doing that, the Soviets are in Magna, Utah, the same thing, the same experience with Americans who had never seen a Soviet before and curiosity and all this. And one of the more interesting parts of my job was to go to Votkinsk and then fly back to the United States and go to Magna and meet with the Soviets and work out and say, hey, what's the problem here for you? What would you like improved? Hey, this is what's happening to us in Votkinsk. We don't like that. How can we need you to call Votkinsk and say that things are good here, or they'll say, hey, we have problems here. Can you guys call the Americans? And I would sit there with the FBI and everybody and say, you need to lift this restriction. You need to do this to create reciprocity, but not reciprocity about inspections, reciprocity about basic humanity, how to learn to treat one another as human beings outside of the framework of arms control and distrust. I mean, trust but verify works when you're dealing with factories and missiles and all that. But when you're dealing with people interacting with people, with Russians, Soviets interacting with American citizens, Americans inspectors interacting with Soviet citizens, this isn't an inspection. This is life. And it was a fascinating experience trying to work those issues across to make sure that the Soviets were treated like human beings in Magna, Utah, and we were treated like human beings in Votkinsk.
And Scott, in your book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroyka, you also mentioned that there was a side effect to the disarmament. The town of Votkinsk, that was very much so oriented as to producing a lot of weaponry and, military contracts. When the disarmament that you guys were working on, started to get some tractions and became in progress, a lot of those people found themselves without work. Do you have an idea? Let's say there is American people who watch that and they work for the military industrial complex or the industries, and they say, well, if we do all this disarmament that Scott proposes, are we going to lose our jobs? Do we have to then refurbish our plans for some civilian purposes? And how many years will it take? Because in your book, again, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroyka, you mentioned that the town, the Soviet town you were in, did not account for the difficulties and amount of time that it's going to take for them to start producing things for civilian industry. And it was quite a difficult change. And I applaud you for being a foreigner who had compassion to note it in your book and not, pretend that that problem didn't exist on the backdrop of the success that you had. But still, there was this human factor that was sort of a byproduct of it. And you certainly felt compassion. And I could see it in your book and how you write about it. Very commendable on your part that you had the heart to even see that problem, because most people wouldn't even care. Hey, I'm here to do the job. I mean, you guys deal with your own problems. How would you tell Americans that disarmament would affect their life should it be along the lines that you're thinking, and new treaties and whatnot? And would they lose their jobs?
Well, let's remember when I said how Votkinsk, how the portal was that we created this to deal with a unique problem, but then we had to replicate it in Magna because of reciprocity. So we artificially created a portal environment so there was reciprocity. We could do that. What we couldn't do is make sure that American society and American economic reality replicated Soviet society and Soviet economic reality. In the United States, we don't have the equivalent of Votkinsk. We don't have the Votkinsk Production Association. We don't have a factory town where everything's controlled by, we used to, but not in modern society. So in Magna, Utah, the Hercules plant that produced these rocket motors wasn't the premier factory in the Salt Lake City area. It was one of many. So if you shut down the Magna plant, the personnel there would be able to get jobs elsewhere. It didn't mean the end of the town. The town didn't cease to function. So that's one thing. We deal with private industry, and we, oftentimes when they compete for missiles, they lose the competition. And if they lose the competition, the plant has to be shut down anyways. That has nothing to do with disarmament. That's just the way the American process works. It's different in the Soviet Union, especially at that time. The Votkinsk factory produced at the time of the INF Treaty the SS-25 missile, the SS-20 missile, the SS-12, which was an intermediate range missile, the SS-23, which is a short range missile that was covered by the treaty, and then the Scud missile, and then they had other missiles under development, one called the Courier, which is a small ICBM. The INF Treaty came and it got rid of the SS-20, the SS-12, and the SS-23. It got rid of 3 of the 4 major systems being produced. The Scud missile was being phased out anyways, which means that because of the INF Treaty, the Votkinsk factory, remember, every time you produce a missile, it's not just that they get money for a missile. Each missile, and I broke it down in the book about how many man hours goes into it, the specific kind of manufacturing skills and stuff, because the Russians the Soviets tried to transition to peace industry, and they were trying to build these computer numerical controlled lathes, these giant machine tools. And they compared the manpower input into an SS-23 with these lathes, and they said, oh, we have similar skill sets, so we can take these SS-23 workers, convert them to this lathe. But the problem is that lathe wasn't the best the Soviets had, because at that time, the best the Soviets had were the top secret stuff they used to produce their missiles. This was a lathe for export. And when they put it on the global market, it couldn't compete with the others. The things that could compete were the secret lathes, but the Russians weren't going to put that on the market. So they couldn't convert, even though they had this lathe, that they thought would be replicating the workforce. They couldn't sell it, so it failed. Same thing with the SS-20. When you're producing 80 SS-20s a year and 60 SS-25s a year, you have a workforce where there's some crossover, but then you get rid of the SS-20, you literally have reduced the output by over 60%. Where does that workforce go? How do you employ them? How do you keep them employed? It was a big problem for Vodkinsk. And so, Vodkinsk was a town that was living the life of plenty and suddenly became a town of nothing because of disarmament. But they did it anyways. They bought into it. I mean, the guys we were working with, I wrote in there about Yegor Efremov. I went to his home for New Year's, a really cool experience. But he used to produce. He used to be in a top secret. I only found about this later, so I didn't write about it in the book. So he said, no, he used to produce the post-boost vehicle for the SS-20 and the SS-25. One of the most sensitive things, highly skilled labor, but he no longer does it. So now he became a guy who worked with the Americans to make the treaty work. Imagine how, not bitter, but I mean, the mixed emotions he has to feel about losing a job he'd been doing his whole life. Now he's doing this other job while watching other workers go unemployed. At the same time this is happening, Russia's going through perestroika, as you talked about. Gorbachev's implementing perestroika. And perestroika is restructuring. And one of the things that perestroika was doing was going from the centralized state planning where there was a norm and money would go to produce the norm directed by the state to what they call kozorashot. And I may be mispronouncing that term, but basically cost effectiveness, that you have to, that the factory has to produce things and sell things and make a profit on its own. It's not going to get a subsidy from the state anymore. And they're doing this transition and it's ugly. It's not working. Nothing's going on. Now we're inspectors and we live in the town and we can see things are not great, but how did we learn all this? Because of another thing called glasnost, openness. When we arrived in Vodkinsk, we were interviewed by the editor of the local Communist Party newspaper, Leninsky Put, Way of Lenin. And Elvira was her name. And, it was an interesting interview. She was asking interesting questions, but it was very, stolid, proper, what you would expect of a state-controlled media. But we all subscribed to the Leninsky Put anyways because it gave us an insight. And the interesting thing about reading the local newspaper is then when you walk around the town, you get to see it all come to life. Hey, I read about that. I read about this school. I read about this store. I read about this.
May I interrupt? I
Sure.
remember how you were doing your intelligence gathering trips to the library, trying to sneakily obtain some intelligence by requesting the factory's local newspaper.
Yes,
Okay,
yes, yes.
go ahead.
The CIA directed me to try and find this newspaper. And so I went to the library for legitimate reasons. I'm a historian. And so I went to the library, to the factory library, because remember, the factory runs everything.
Yes.
So I went to the library and I actually checked out books about the Russian Civil War.
Civil War, yes,
in that area.
right.
And so I'm doing that, and they're helping me. Then I came in and said, do you happen to have a copy of, I forget what it was, Trudnaya Vakhta, I think was the name of the paper. And they went, what does that have to do with the Civil War? I said, I'm just interested.
Yeah,
like,
right.
No, stick with the Civil War, buddy. But no, Leninsky Put didn't have the same level because it wasn't the factory paper. It was the town paper. But the thing about Glasnost is Elvira took it seriously. She and her staff, and they started asking questions of Communist Party officials that nobody had asked before. They started investigating things, and we're reading about it. And we're learning everything, the good, the bad, the ugly about Vodkinsk. And Vodkinsk came to life. And there were people like me who really cared about it. I mean, trust me, there were some inspectors, all they wanted to do is do their job, stay in there. They didn't care. They were closed-minded, all that. Other inspectors looked around at the Soviet Union and went, you're dirty, you're this, nose in the air. But there was a handful of us who actually cared and were there to learn. And we respected our counterparts. We respected Vodkinsk. We fell in love with Vodkinsk, to be honest. We fell in love with the place. But we're watching this, and it was tough because you're watching a friend suffer. That was the hardest part about it, is you're watching a friend. So we still had a job to do. That was our only reason to be there. But now we're watching good friend suffer. And we're able to document it. We have all the newspapers. We're out there. And I tried to capture it in the book. I mean, it is really a sad state of affairs. And, the subtitle of the book, it's Disarmament at the Time of Perestroyka, but Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union. And I talk about the role that the INF Treaty played in the coup, the August coup that eventually, led to not only the downfall of Gorbachev, but the downfall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union. Remember early on, I talked about that other missile, that fifth missile, the short ICBM. They called it the Courier. And the Courier was going to be the great economic white knight for Vodkinsk. You see, they had the SS-25, but if they could get the Courier up and produce the Courier, once again, Vodkinsk would be that great missile-producing town with the income coming in. It would revive the economy and make everything great. But Gorbachev decided, because of disarmament, he wanted to get rid of the Courier. They didn't want to produce it. And so there was a clash between him and defense industry over this. At one point in time, the Minister of Defense ordered the Courier production to be shut down, but defense industry said no, because the man who was the defense, the minister, was from Vodkinsk. And he had promised people. The interesting thing about Perestroika is there was an election in 1989. And I actually got to be, I was an eyewitness to it. I write about it in the book. It was fascinating to see democracy in action. But one of the byproducts of this is that the defense minister, the minister of defense industry, ran for the local seat to represent at the People's Congress, and he lost the election. But my point is, when he was running, he was promising the people of Vodkinsk that he will take care of them. And when he lost the election, he still went back as defense industry minister and tried to take care of them by keeping this missile alive. And so it came down to the point where they needed to start testing these missiles, and missiles had to be produced to be tested. And Gorbachev wanted to shut it down. And in August, a document went before Gorbachev to shut down the Courier altogether, to do no testing. And when Gorbachev signed that and then went to Crimea for his vacation, the defense industry minister got together with the head of the KGB. They met in a sauna, and thus began the coup. And the straw that broke the camel's back was the decision by Gorbachev to sign the document that shut down the Courier missile. The INF Treaty played an important role in the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Scott, sounds like you turned the clock of times many times by being very humble inspector, as you describe yourself. But what you guys were doing seems to have played a role in a lot of people's lives.
No, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. But remember, it was a teamwork. Believe me, if it had been left up to just me, it wouldn't have happened. I had a lot of help. a lot of
help. But Scott, I have a couple of questions about the current situation, Russia Ukraine, and what do you think is the outcome of this might be? Do you believe that it's going to end in 1 year, 10 years? Do you believe it's going to be a nuclear exchange? Do you believe our President Biden would one day wake up and decide to wrap it up, just like Afghanistan was wrapped up? And if you were advisor to the Biden administration, looking, let's say, pretend that they're looking for the ramp off of this, what would you advise on how to make sure to de-escalate this? Loaded question, but just kind of along the lines of the potential outcomes, the future, the time frame, and what do you think needs to be done if we wanted to wrap this up?
There's an old saying that you can't solve a problem unless you first accurately define it. Because if you don't define the problem properly, what you're claiming to solve isn't the problem, it's something else, and we're going on. So we have to be careful to understand how we got to where we are. The common narrative today is that this was an unprovoked act of aggression on the part of Russia against Ukraine. But that's just simply false. The fact of the matter is the United States and NATO have been plotting against Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you recall, Mikhail Gorbachev, when the Berlin Wall went down, was concerned about the potential reunification of Germany. Russia had 400,000 troops stationed in East Germany. People tend to forget that Germany lost World War II. It was Nazi Germany, and they were occupied for a reason. And there was no peace treaty. There had been no peace treaty because the United States wouldn't allow there to be a peace treaty. We wanted to split up into West and East and all this. But now the walls come down. The Germans want to be reunited. And Gorbachev recognized the historical inevitability of that. But he was concerned because West Germany was a member of NATO. And if Germany unites, would NATO expand into East Germany? And that would be a threat against Poland, against everybody else. And so Gorbachev and his and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, met with James Baker and other NATO leaders. And James Baker wrote a memorandum after his meeting that said he had promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, that NATO forces in Germany would never go into East Germany. And by extension, that meant that NATO wasn't going to expand into the former Warsaw Pact nations as well. When Baker came back and briefed this to the National Security Council and the interagency community here in the United States, they basically laughed him down and said, no, 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 boss, we're going to expand NATO. You see, NATO is going to be used as a tool to contain Russia, to ensure Russia never again rises up to challenge us in a way that the Soviet Union did. So anybody who lived through Russia in the 1990s understands how horrible it was. It was literally
I did. Yep.
Very difficult time. The economy was collapsed. The government was corrupt, inefficient. The oligarchs took over. They were robbing Russia blind. It was just a very, very dark time. And that made us happy. You see, because Russia was weak. Russia was, neutered. We were exploiting their economy. We're dominating them politically. Anybody who says the 1990s was the age of democracy in Russia doesn't know what they're talking about. I only have to point them to October 1993, when Yeltsin put tanks on the streets in Moscow to fire on the Russian parliament. Democracies don't have executives using tanks to fire on the legislative branch. Not a democracy. Or 1996, you know how we talk about 2016, how the Russians were seeking to steal the election. We now know that that's a lie. But one thing that's not a lie is 2016, I said 1996 in Russia, we stole an election for Yeltsin. He would not have won re-election in 1996. We stole it. We admit it. We put it on Time magazine and bragged about it. That's how much we dominated Russia. That was our goal. When Yeltsin resigned at the end of 1999, he's surrounded by what they called the family. And not only was it his family, his daughter, his son-in-law, but there was a whole host of people who were like wolves around a sheep, waiting for the sheep to die so they could eat it. They're just all sitting there going, yes, one of us is going to be the leader to resume this corruption, this ineffective government, this horrible thing that the West loved. See, we loved Russia being corrupt and weak and inefficient and inept and pathetic. We loved it. And so there's a whole bunch of people ready to do that. And I think Yeltsin realized that he had made a fundamental mistake. In fact, in his farewell address, he says, I have made mistakes. And you know how he rectified the mistake? He reached out and touched somebody that nobody had heard of before. Nobody thought he wasn't part of the family. He wasn't one of the wolves. He was the ultimate outsider. His name was Vladimir Putin, and he made him president in his stead. Now, the United States looked at that. Bill Clinton went, that's okay. Putin will never get elected in the next election in March of 2000 because we Americans, we control everything. We'll make sure he doesn't get elected. We'll put our person in. Putin won the election. And Putin never played that game. And the United States has hated Putin ever since because Putin has decided that Russia is going to stand up back on its feet. Russia is going to rebuild. Russia is going to become the nation it deserves to be. Not just for the Russian people that are resident in the Russian Federation, but as he said in 2005, for all Russians, meaning that the Russian nation is composed of not just people who reside in, but he said the greatest tragedy of the last century One of the greatest tragedies of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why? Because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. No home, no capital, nothing. They were left on their own. And he said, that cannot happen. We must protect the Russian people. And he began a policy of doing just that. We did not like this. We opposed it. We tried to destroy Russia through the Chechen conflict. A lot of people don't understand what happened during the Second Chechen War, where the United States poured in millions of dollars to fund the Chechen opposition. And we brought in foreign fighters, jihadists, to radicalize the Chechen population, because our goal was to get Chechnya to break away from Russia, thereby setting in motion potential other nations to break away, not only the Northern Caucasus, but Bashkiria, Udmurtia, Tataria, all these other nations. We wanted them to break up, we wanted to dismember Russia. That was our objective. And Putin didn't let it happen. We hate Vladimir Putin, and we've hated him ever since. And so how did we manifest that hate? Well, in 2008, an interesting thing, then Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, wrote a memorandum called Niet means Niet, no means no. And he said, if we invite Ukraine into NATO, it will cross a red line that would inevitably lead to Russia's military intervention in Ukraine, and probably Ukraine losing the Donbass and Crimea. 2008, we knew this. That was written in April. In November, we invited Ukraine to join NATO. What does that tell you? That we knew by doing this, we were setting in motion a sequence of events that would, as Ambassador Burns said, lead to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We wanted Russia to invade Ukraine. That was our entire policy objective in 2008. In 2014, we overthrew the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. When I say we, understand Victoria Nuland is on a phone call talking about her boy Yatsenko.
Yes.
This is before Yanukovych is released, and she's already handpicked the future leader of Ukraine, an American person, somebody we picked. You know, it's just humiliating of Ukraine to understand what we did to you. And then in the conflicts that emerged from that, in August and September in 2014, the Ukrainian army got surrounded in Donetsk, north of the capital city of Donetsk. I can't remember the exact town, the name of it, but they were surrounded, 10,000 of them, and they were going to die. The Russians haven't admitted it, but I think the evidence is clear that Russian troops had intervened and helped the local militias surround the Ukrainians, and they were going to kill them all. This would have radically changed everything. It would have meant that the new government of Yatsenko and, forget who was the president at the time.
Yatsenyuk and Poroshenko, you mean the next one?
Well,
Or
Poroshenko became the president after that, but Yatsenyuk maybe. But it means that they were going to collapse.
Klitschko was the mayor. Yeah, Klitschko was the Kiev
mayor.
mayor.
Yeah. So, but Germany and France intervened through what they call the Normandy format. And they said, let's do something called the Minsk Accords. We want a ceasefire. We want a path towards peace. Putin could have destroyed the Ukrainian army, but he chose peace. He said, okay, I'll sign up for this. So the Russians have always been looking for a peaceful outcome. But now we have the confessions of Poroshenko, Merkel, and Hollande, the French president, the three premier people who say Minsk was always a sham. We never intended to make it happen. We're buying time so that NATO could rebuild the Ukrainian army. For what purpose? To launch offensive operations to capture all of the Donbass and retake Crimea, which Russia annexed in April of 2014, basically to go to war with Russia. That was the purpose. Designed in 2014, they spent 8 years preparing this military. The United States built a military training facility in Western Ukraine that every 55 days trained 1 battalion of Ukrainian troops to NATO standards for the sole purpose of killing Russians in eastern Ukraine. Over 30,000 Ukrainian troops were trained by the United States. Another 60,000 were trained by other NATO forces. 90,000 Ukrainian forces ready to attack the Donbass and Crimea. This is why Russia intervened. It is literally collective self-defense, preemptive collective self-defense. This is the war that was started. And the reason why I bring that up is your question was, how do we solve this problem? Well, the problem must be defined as a war started by the West. A war started by the West. All right. So if I'm advising Biden, I would say we have to acknowledge that we have failed. that this is not going to succeed, that Russia is going to win. We have to acknowledge that. So now the question is, how do we mitigate the consequences of a Russian victory? The first thing is to put on our humanitarian hat. We have to understand, and I think everybody needs to understand this, that every single Ukrainian soldier that has died, every single Ukrainian civilian that has died, every building that's been destroyed, every electrical generation capability has been destroyed, it's the fault of the United States, Germany, France, and NATO. They are 100% to blame. Russia is blameless in all of this. So we have to say, if we care about Ukrainian people, we must make suffering stop. And the only way you can make the suffering stop is to end this conflict on terms that Russia will accept. Russia is the only voice that counts right now, but we're not going to do that. So what's that tell you? We don't care about Ukraine. We are willing to sacrifice Ukraine to achieve our objectives, but our objectives are unattainable. And the irony of this is, I mean, this is sort of funny, but it's not, because we're talking about the tragedy of the Ukraine conflict. But I was put on a list. There was a group created, the Center for the Countering of Disinformation, which works underneath President Zelensky. And the job is to identify people out there who are saying things that run counter to the narrative being pushed by Kiev. So I'm on that list. I feature prominently. I am an information terrorist, a Russian propagandist. I am a war criminal who should be arrested and prosecuted for this. My number one crime, and this is where I have to chuckle, my number one crime was that I said that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was a proxy war between NATO and Russia. I said this back in March. I've been saying it ever since. Interestingly, earlier this year, the Ukrainian defense minister has come out and said the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and that it's the Ukrainian forces that are sacrificing their blood, and NATO must provide the equipment. Exactly what I said. Now, I'm waiting for his name to appear next to mine on this list, but it won't. This shows you the absurdity of what's going on right now, where the narrative is so far removed from reality. But if America is going to solve this problem, we have to stop. One of the best ways to put out a fire is to deny fuel to the fire. If you remove fuel from the fire, nothing burns, the fire goes out. The fuel for this fire is the equipment we're providing Ukraine. If we stop providing that equipment, the fire would go out because Ukraine couldn't continue to resist. Russia would prevail. Ukraine's already lost 20% of its territory. It will never get this territory back. I ask people to familiarize themselves with the Russian Constitution, Article 65, that talks about the inviolability of Mother Russia. Once something is brought into Mother Russia, it is Mother Russia forever. It's not going to be traded away. So all this Ukrainian hope, and this is where it gets serious, because Ukrainians are saying we need this weaponry so that we can launch an attack to liberate the Donbass, to liberate Kherson, Zaporizhia, and liberate Crimea. But what they're saying is to strip away Mother Russia. Now, I know the Ukrainians don't view it as Mother Russia, but the Russians do. And as soon as Russia's nuclear doctrine is quite simple. If you use nuclear weapons against us, the dead hand, we kill everything, that's Vidanya. But the other thing they say is if you threaten the existential survival of Russia with conventional military power, we will have to use nuclear weapons to resolve that issue. So if NATO was successful in building a Ukrainian army that was capable of doing what the Ukrainian leadership says it wants to do, that is by definition an existential threat to the survival of the Russian state, and Russia will use nuclear weapons to stop it. This is a statement of fact. So I would tell the president that we have to stop this mad rush towards nuclear annihilation, that what we need to do is go back to basic principles. We are in danger if we continue this policy of not only being humiliated in Ukraine like we were in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but of destroying that which we claim to be supporting, NATO. Right now, because of the United States, Europe has embarked on a policy of sanctioning Russia, especially Russian energy, that's backfired. It's not the Russian economy that is suffering. It is the European economy that's suffering. And there's already deep fractures within the European economy about this. Even France and Germany now are starting to question the United States policy, noting that they denied them access to cheap Russian gas, meanwhile selling them liquid natural gas at exorbitant prices that are causing industries to shut down and people not be able to pay their bills. So there's already anger there. Now the United States is asking them to empty their arsenals and turn this weaponry over to Ukraine at a time when, and here's the unintended consequence. General Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, in May traveled to Kiev and then came, I think, Warsaw, and he gave a speech where he said the goal and objective is to weaken Russia. Basically, we're using Ukraine to weaken Russia. Hey, General, pro tip, it didn't work. You see, Russia's stronger today than it was on February 24th of last year. Russian military on February 24th was in a peacetime composition. And there were a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of inadequacies. The command structure wasn't perfect. The mobilization structure wasn't perfect. There was just a lot wrong with it. And these flaws became exposed when Russia moved into Ukraine. The Russians have learned a lot of mistakes. I bring us to American history. In 1943 or 1942, I'm sorry, we deployed to North Africa to fight the Germans there. And there's a famous battle called Kasserine Pass. And the 2nd U.S. Army Corps fought the Germans at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, El Guitar, and we were beat badly, humiliating. Why? Because the American military was poorly organized, poorly led, poorly equipped, had bad tactics and everything. And we went to battle and we got beat. But then another general came in named George Patton, who learned the lessons of Kasserine Pass, reinvigorated the army, and then went out and beat the Germans. And then in 1943, continued to beat them in Sicily. And in 1944, we started beating them in Italy and in France. And we turned this volunteer army of Americans, 12 million strong, who were a bunch of guys who didn't want to be in the military, into hardened killers, guys who lived to kill Nazis, recognizing that the only way they got to go home was to kill as many Nazis as possible. And we became the best military in the world, killing people. The Russian military that started the invasion or whatever you call it, special military operation, the military operation against Ukraine, was not the best army in the world. It actually was pretty inept. It made a lot of mistakes. They had some good equipment, they had good leaders, good fighters, but they were stumbling all around. It wasn't a perfectly executed plan. They've mobilized 300,000 men. These are men who were taken from their homes, men who were taken from their wives, taken from their daughters, their sons. They were, other people's sons, taken from their parents, taken from their jobs, taken from their communities. They had already served their country and they were done with serving their country, but called upon to serve their country again. These guys are coming into a Russian military that has learned all the mistakes of the past, has made changes, and is becoming far more efficient, far more deadly. And these guys are going to become the most efficient killers of Ukrainians in the world. Nazis, the Azov, Aidar, Kraken,
Tornado, yeah.
all the Tornado, all these other units, they're all going to die. Why? Because these guys know the only way they get home by killing every Ukrainian bearing arms in front of them. And so what's about to happen is a nightmare for Ukraine, because Ukraine is about to be overwhelmed with the most efficient killing machine in the world today, and that's the Russian army. They are ready, they are willing, they are able, and they're going to do it. This is what I would tell the president. Our plan has backfired. We have failed. Russians are stronger than ever. It's not just what they're doing in the special military operation, but thanks to the idiocy of our policy, Russia is expanding its military to 1.5 million. It's not just building a larger military. Their defense industry is actually working right now full time to not only supply the special military operation with all of the weapons and ammunition it needs, equip this new expanded military. What is our defense industry doing? Nothing. The same production schedule that we had during peacetime. The Russians are on a near wartime footing. We're not. Mr. President, we have lost, and we have to cut our losses. We have to get out of this and see if we can regroup. And our regrouping can't be to continue the failed policy of trying to destroy Russia. Russia ain't never going to be destroyed right now. We missed our opportunity. What we have to do is convince Russia that it's in their best interest to live in peaceful coexistence with us. We don't want Russia on a war footing. We want Russia to be a nation that we can peacefully coexist. This means we have to work with the Europeans to repair relations with the Russians. That's what I would recommend. It's not going to happen because too many people have a vested interest in continuing this. One of the things I learned as an officer, junior officer, is it doesn't matter if you're right. When you're standing in front of the general and explaining, you're losing. When you're explaining, you're losing. And no American politician wants to now go out and explain to the American people why decades-long Russophobia is wrong. How do we tell the American people to hate Russians one day, but suddenly we want to be friends with them the next day? It's a very difficult thing to do. So the solution is not going to come from the Biden administration. What we need right now are responsible military leaders who keep this from stumbling into a war and hope that we can elect a new president in 2024 that will free himself of this Russophobic tendencies, trends, and begin to work not to confront Russia, but to peacefully coexist with Russia, inclusive, hopefully, of arms control. But even if we can't get arms control, at least not trying to destroy Russia by accumulating conventional military power. Russia's beaten us. Their army is big. Their army is capable. It's ready to fight. We're getting ready to pour in a huge shopping list of equipment into Ukraine. People need to understand that all we're doing is guaranteeing the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. That's all we've accomplished here. We may kill thousands of Russians in the process, but they're going to slaughter the Ukrainians. Russia will not lose this war because Russia cannot lose this war.
Scott, very well explained. Thank you. I think a lot of American people do not understand that. They think about, oh, Russia is going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. No, Russia explicitly said that if it ever has to use nuclear weapons, that will be used against NATO countries.
Yep.
So people here grilling hot dogs and drinking beer thinking, oh, those Russians and Ukrainians, if something happens, it's going to be them. No, it's going to be us. And
Yep.
people in Europe and German bases at Ramstein, where they're meeting now, and going to meet, I believe, on the 20th or so, deciding to provide Ukraine with more weapons, which you so rightly mentioned, do nothing but kill more Ukrainians. While we American people are told that we are saving Ukraine, nothing could be further from the truth. We are destroying Ukraine. We were the ones with Obama administration and Biden vice president at the time, Victoria Nuland, who orchestrated with EU-backed, US-backed coup that removed the democratically elected president of Ukraine in 2014 and set Ukraine on the path of destruction when it started to bomb its own citizens in eastern Ukraine. And now that those citizens asked Russia for military assistance under, I believe you said, Article 51 of collective self-defense, and Russian parliament voted to approve providing that military assistance, and Russian army came into Donbass area, and this just mushrooms in a bigger war, all could have been avoided if our favorite politicians' foreign policy wouldn't be running around changing regimes, but would be actually doing something productive and something to accomplish the stability or security framework in the world. But so far, it almost seems like we're coming back to what you said in the beginning. Did we stop being adult in the room? I mean, what's going on with us? The United States. And I am, as American citizen, as somebody who loves America, I would like to see us be better or do better. I would like this to show responsibility and not to put the world on the brink of nuclear war over some ambitions of some dinosaur political fossil politicians that don't know any better than, let's say, the Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, that refers to America has to be this hegemon and boss everybody around. We obviously see this doesn't work. Whether Biden likes to admit it or not, with his "we are the new world order and I am a leader of new world," well, newsflash, Mr. Biden, Putin and the chairman Xi just told you the world's not long going to be a unipolar world. You either adapt or you do what? Or you're going to bring us to the nuclear war to assert your hegemony because you don't see the reality on the ground, and you need to kill more Ukrainians because you just can't have enough of your donors make more money off of those weapons? I don't understand that. And you're willing, as Mr. Biden, our president, and his surrounding, put our American people lives at stake to doing so, to promote their ideas of a yesteryear, of the past, of something that doesn't work anymore. The world reality has changed. I'm just sitting all of this and thinking, American people do not understand that if there was a nuclear weapons to be used, Russia is not going to use them against Ukraine.
No,
It's going to be using against everybody
Paris.
who doesn't think that they're going to come their way.
Yeah, Paris, Rome, London, Berlin, Brussels, Madrid, you name it, it'll disappear. That's just the reality of it. You know, you talk about Brzezinski's book, The American Chess Board. What a stupid title. Want to know why?
Grand chess board or something along those lines.
Right, but who's the best? Yeah. What's the nation that produces the best chess players in the world?
Russia. Yay,
oh yeah.
Ding,
so
ding, ding.
do you really want to play chess against the Russians? And then we go to China, and they don't play chess; they play Chinese checkers. So the Chinese are playing a completely different game than the one Brzezinski's talking about. It's just stupid. It shows the hubris of Americans to think that we get to dictate outcomes. The rest of the world, as I said before, they've left mommy's basement. They're out. They have jobs. They're fully employed. They're making more money than their parents. They have better cars than their parents. They have a better lifestyle than their parents. And their parents is America. And America's sitting there saying, no. You must do what mommy says. You must do what daddy says. And they're saying, nah, boss, we're doing our own thing, which is cute until you bring in nuclear weapons. And then the world ends. And but Biden, I don't know if you know my history with Joe Biden, but we go back a long time, and we actually had a big famous fight on the floor.
I watched a little video because YouTube sent me that suggested video when Scott Ritter sits facing Mr. Biden, the senator. Yes. It was a quick exchange where I think he displayed himself in the most disgraceful manner.
Yeah, that's Joe.
And no American should ever be caught in this situation on his side, on the side of how he behaved himself being a United States senator. I thought it was despicable and disgraceful.
No, but that's who he is. I mean, we need to understand who we elected. That's who we elected. This man, this liar, this horrific human being. But he ran on a platform. And I told everybody, don't believe anything. Remember, he's a plagiarist. He's an admitted plagiarist. He lies about his record, his background, his education. He can't tell the truth about anything. It's all about Joe Biden, the narcissist. And so he runs on a platform and he says, I want to return America's nuclear policy to the sole purpose doctrine, meaning the sole purpose of American nuclear weapons is to defend against a nuclear attack, that we will not use nuclear weapons unless we are attacked with nuclear weapons. Okay, that would be nice, Joe. If you do that, maybe I'll change my mind about you. But in October of last year, he published the National Security Strategy of the United States, inclusive of the updated nuclear posture review. And we didn't see sole purpose. What we saw is a continuation of nuclear posture began under George W. Bush, post 9/11 world, where America says we can use nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear scenario, meaning we're not waiting for somebody to attack or somebody with nuclear weapons. At any time we decide we need to, whether it's a cyber attack, whether you blinked at us wrong, whether you wore the wrong color lipstick or something, we get to nuke you because we're America, we're the superpower, we get to do what we want. Joe Biden couldn't change America's addiction to nuclear weapons. What makes us believe that Joe Biden can control this? We need a commander-in-chief that has the ability, the capacity to impose his will on the nuclear establishment to keep them from inching us towards nuclear conflict and instead move us away and disarm. This is absolutely imperative. We have to move back and disarm. And if we don't have that kind of leader, you and I are having this conversation today. We may not be having this conversation next year because we may not be here. And this is what all those beer drinking, hot dog eating Americans need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, real quick, what about China, Taiwan? I watched some of your interviews. I think you said that China was going to take the Taiwan before the end of this year. I am waiting. What do you think changed?
Well,
Um,
the big thing
did
that
they
changed
step
was
back? And what do you think?
there was an election in Taiwan
Uh-huh.
in November, and the Taiwanese president um, overplayed her hand. See, the election she had wasn't for her. It was sort of the equivalent of midterm elections for Taiwan, where they elect city mayors, council members, and all this stuff. And normally, national security and foreign policy doesn't factor into this. And had she just let the election run its course, her party probably would have won sufficient seats to maintain, a superiority, a majority. Um, but instead, she tried to overplay her hand, and she brought in her cross straits policy, trying to promote a path towards independence, a path towards confrontation, a path towards conflict, which is how the United States was pushing. Had she won that election, China would probably have invaded Taiwan by now, but she lost. The
Uh-huh.
Kuomintang, the opposition party, was able to say no, and instead they won the election. Now, she's still president, but she had to resign as the head of her party and to put Taiwan into a state of flux until 2024. So right now, even though the United States will continue to push Taiwan in this direction, there is no political consensus in Taiwan right now to continue a cross-straits policy with China that could lead to the conditions under which China would invade. Had she won that election, I'm convinced China would have invaded by now, but we were saved literally by the Kuomintang party and her overreach. And as a result, I think we have 2 years grace until 2024 before this problem manifests itself in a way that creates war. And hopefully, in that time, one will get a new president here in the United States that seeks not to have war with China. Two, the Taiwanese people will wake up to new realities that make it more possible for them to accept, the Chinese offer of one nation, two systems. I mean, because all China's saying is literally all we need you to do is say we are part of China, and then you get to live your life exactly as you live it right now. We take down your flag, we put up our flag, and that's it. But nope, they want independence. They want and China will never allow that. But that election is what changed everything.
Do you, Scott, see what's happening with Japan? It just recently signed a pact with Great Britain, I believe, the first European country, as far as them mutually allow each other to place the troops on each other's soil,
Yeah.
supposedly to deter China. I mean,
Yeah,
Japan used to be in charge of Taiwan or own Taiwan at one point. Do you believe Japan is stepping away from being this pacifist constitution after World War II commitment and now trying to become more militarized? And should we be worried about Japan?
well, we could, but let me put it this way. I met with my neighbor yesterday and we signed an agreement about which one of us would be first on Mars. Do you understand how useless that agreement is?
Okay.
Okay, it means nothing. So you say
Okay.
Japan signed an agreement with Great Britain about putting troops on their soil. I don't think Japan's going to be sending any troops over to Great Britain anytime soon. What this is about putting British Marines, allowing to jointly train with the Japanese forces in the in the kiss in the there's an island chain that's contested.
Uh-huh.
But let me put it this way. They just played the World Cup this past summer. Very good games. Viva Argentina. But the stadiums that they built there, you could put the entire British Army in one of those stadiums and still have 40,000 empty seats.
I see.
All right, so are we really worried about the British saying they're going to come? It's like me signing an agreement about going to Mars. The British have no military capacity to project power into the Japanese sphere of influence. It's purely a political thing, but it comes down to what you're saying. It does represent a mindset on the part of Japan that is departing from its post-World War II constitutional restrictions regarding an offensive army. The Japanese military is called the Japanese Self-Defense Force. It's not supposed to be an army capable of projecting power, but now we have a new generation of militarist political leaders in Japan who seek to break away from that, and they're being pushed in that direction by Great Britain, the United States, and Australia. And this is dangerous. Not because the Japanese are ever going to become a global superpower again. They're not. But what it does is create the potential for a conflict between Japan and Russia over these disputed islands.
Islands, yes.
I think the big controlling factor here is that Japan's economy cannot live without Russian gas. And the Japanese are looking at Europe and seeing what happened to the European economy. And the Japanese understand that they are a little island nation that is totally dependent upon imports, and that Russia is becoming increasingly aligned with China. And that if Japan picks a fight with Russia, they'll be picking a fight with China. And if China wants to, they can shut off through the South China Sea. Remember all those nice little islands that China fortified? When China wants to, they can shut it down and nothing gets to Japan, and the Japanese economy disappears. And the Japanese have to wake up to this reality that the United States is no longer the cavalry that's going to ride to their rescue. That because of advanced weaponry, both possessed by both Russia and China, the U.S. Navy, the fleet that used to be the mainstay of our Pacific presence, is now little more than mobile coffins. That an aircraft carrier will be hit by a Russian or Chinese missile and sunk before it can intervene effectively on behalf of Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan. This is the new reality. And the Japanese, I believe, are eventually going to wake up to this. They already got a hint about it when Russia started renegotiating contracts about the production of gas on Sakhalin Island. And the Japanese went, whoa, wait a minute. We don't want to go that route because if they lose that, their economy tanks. So I think the Japanese will wake up. Look, what they did with the British symbolically is important. In terms of real military capability, as I said, you can take a World Cup soccer stadium, fill it with the totality of the British Army, and still have tens of thousands of empty seats. That's how pathetic Britain is today in terms of military power.
Do you, Scott, believe NATO is going to survive the war in Ukraine?
Yes, but they may not survive the post-war period. I think the war in Ukraine is going to create a deep divide in Europe between old Europe, primarily France, Germany, Italy, and others, who are going to recognize that they were used by the United States to pursue American security policy interests to the detriment of their own economy and their national security. You already hear talk from Emmanuel Macron and even the Germans now about the necessity of a European alliance that is free of American influence, separate from NATO. Now, you have New Europe, which is the Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, and those countries who, no, they want to be part of America. They want to be part of this new Eastern bulwark against Russia. But that won't work unless they have all of NATO. And I think you're going to see this divide grow and grow and grow. And eventually, I think you're going to see NATO collapse in its own ineptitude and irrelevance.
You think Russia is waiting for NATO to collapse?
No, Russia doesn't care about NATO anymore.
Okay.
NATO is pathetic. NATO is weak. NATO is nothing. And you see that in the attitude of all the Russians, from Lavrov to Putin. They're just like, we don't care. We literally don't care. I mean, you had Stoltenberg in Madrid last June talking about NATO building 300,000 man rapid reaction force. Where is it, Jan? Where is it? It doesn't exist except in your own mind, your own imagination. Nobody's ready for it. Nobody's funding it. It's not there. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin signed an order to expand the Russian military to 1.5 million, and it's happening as we speak. They're building the equipment. They're finding the men. They're building the contract vehicles. Russia's far ahead of NATO. NATO will never catch up, and eventually Europe will realize that that's a race they just don't want to run. Their economies are junked right now. You really can't talk about allocating hundreds of billions of euros to build a military when your people are unemployed, your factories are shut down, your economy is not just in a recession, but maybe in a depression. So I think eventually this thing we call NATO, this artifice, this artifact from World War II and the Cold War, it has no legitimate reason to exist. And sooner or later, many European countries are going to recognize that. And when that happens, it's the end of NATO.
It's the end of it. Well, Scott, there is so much more I would like to ask you, but we'll save it for another time. I hope there will be another time, right?
Absolutely. Anytime you want, reach out, and I'll be more than happy to do it.
Thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate it. And thank you very much for your time. I again encourage everybody to could you please lift up your cup, Scott, to buy and read Scott's book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroyka? What's the underneath title, Scott, to that?
Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union.
Yes. And where can people find your book, Scott?
Well, they can find it. They can go to the publisher's page, Clarity Press, and look for search it there, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, or they can go to my website, which is scottritterextra.com, where we have a link to the book. And you can also get access to all the articles I write and all the podcasts I do. For instance, when you send me a link to this podcast, I'll post it on scottritterextra.com so everybody has a chance to view it. So that's
that would be excellent. That would be excellent, Scott. It is my honor and privilege to have sit down with Scott Ritter today with the discussion regarding his wonderful books. Scott is a writer. Please check out other books that he's written. I personally have one here that I intend to read soon, and it says The End Game. It's a great name for the book. I love it. And there is some other ones that I would like to also read. Thank you very much, Scott, and I hope we'll do it again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and we will definitely do it again.